Hello, fifth grade students. Today we're going to be talking about the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution was an important war to American history because prior to the American Revolution, which occurred in 1775, prior to that, we were part of Britain. We were the British colonies. And as a result, we had to follow British laws and British rules. So, some things occurred that caused us to decide that we would no longer be part of the British colonies. Okay? So, today I'm going to read you a little bit about how we became an independent country by talking to you about the causes of the American Revolution. And then I want to make sure you know what those causes are. So you're going to do a Google Slides for me this week that shows me the causes of the American Revolution. And I'm going to show you what resource to use. And it's going to be really short. Okay? So here's your introduction. The origins of the American Revolution. The seeds of the American Revolution were planted during the French and Indian War. When the war ended in 1763, the victorious British took control of all the French territory in North America. This territory included Canada and stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi River. But the war had been very expensive, and with that victory, the British had also acquired a huge mountain of debt. So how are they going to pay it back? How are they going to get out of debt? The British Parliament, with King George III's backing, expected the colonists, that's the British colonists, that's us, to help pay for the war and for the additional soldiers needed to keep order along the new frontiers. Without consulting the colonists, Parliament began to impose taxes upon them and found other ways to intrude on their lives. Okay? So here's some examples of that. The Quartering Act of 1765 forced the colonists to provide food, shelter, and supplies for troops. So basically what that meant is you're chilling at home, you get a knock on the door. It's a British troop. He says, I need food, I need a place to stay. You may have one bed and enough food for your family, but you are required by law to feed. You're required by law to feed that person. You are also required to give them your bed if they ask for it. So you may have to sleep on the floor and give them what little food you got left. Okay? So needless to say, that was very unpopular with the colonists. This act was followed by the Stamp Act of 1765, which was a tax on a wide variety of official documents, as well as newspapers, calendars, and playing cards. Once the tax was paid, the item received an official ink stamp, which like the custom stamp, which is like the custom stamps on the passports today. So, to publish a newspaper, a calendar, make playing cards, send a letter, any of that stuff, you had to pay a tax for a stamp to be added to it to make sure that it was like an official document. Okay? If you didn't have it, then it wasn't an official document. You couldn't even post a newspaper without it. All right. The Townshend Acts of 1767 came after that, and they were designed to raise revenue to pay the salaries of British government officials in America. So here's the American response. The Americans were outraged. Patrick Henry, a member of Virginia's colonial government, and the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is like the local government for Virginia. Eloquently declared, taxation without representation is tyranny. So basically, the British had a parliament, and there were no citizens from the British colonies in parliament. We had no government representation. Okay? So they were like, okay, we're not going to give you representatives, but we're going to tax you to death. So that's what they did. So they were like, we want some people in parliament. If you're going to tax us, and we need to be treated like every other British citizen, we need to be represented in parliament, and we need to get the same freedoms and things that they get. This statement became the rallying cry of a widening protest that took the British Parliament by surprise. Over the span of a decade, the divide between the colonies and Great Britain grew. The core issue continued to be who had the right to tax the colonists and make the laws they were supposed to obey. Parliament and King George III claimed they did, but the American colonists asserted that unless they were represented in Parliament, the British government had no such right. Agitation against British rule increased and began to express itself in open rebellion. One of the first such acts led to the Boston Massacre. Now, this really was not a massacre, okay? The Boston Massacre started with a confrontation between some Bostonians and a British sentry that quickly drew a crowd. When the sentry called for help, a group of 8 armed British soldiers, led by Captain Thomas Preston, came to his aid. But then a mob gathered, taunting the soldiers and throwing rocks and sticks at them. Accounts of exactly what happened next differ. What is known for certain is that at one point, the soldiers panicked and fired on the mob. Okay? Only 5 colonists were killed in this, and several others were wounded. But the Sons of Liberty, which was a group led by Samuel Adams, used this as opportunity to make it bigger than it was. So they called it a massacre. And they said the British fired on innocent people. That's basically what they said. Okay? So news of the incident quickly spread. Samuel Adams, who belonged to a patriot group known as the Son of Liberty, asked Paul Revere, a silversmith and fellow patriot, to engrave a picture of the scene. The engravement was painted and sent throughout the colonies, further igniting anti-British sentiment because they said they killed innocents. They shot at people. Okay? A few years later, in 1773, there was a protest of a different kind. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was a protest over a new tax on tea. Okay? So, basically how this worked was the tax itself was small, but King George III and Parliament wanted to prove that they could impose any tax on the colonists that they wished. To the Americans, it was just another example of taxation without representation. So in Boston, a group of patriots decided to dress themselves up as a Native American, board the British tea ships in the harbor, and dump all their cargo of tea in the water. Because basically, what happened was you could not drink any tea but British tea. So you could get in trouble if you were drinking any other tea. And there was no other tea available at the little shops. So you had to buy British tea, and they taxed that. So you had to pay a tax on it. Okay? When they were finished, 342 chests of British-owned tea had been thrown overboard. The act was very daring, but a peaceful protest. Nobody was hurt, and nothing else on the ships was damaged or destroyed. Just the tea. Tea was thrown in the water. Still, King George III was furious. He demanded that Parliament pass a series of laws designed to punish the people of Boston and at the same time imitate the rest of the colonies. So they established these laws called the Coercive Acts. That's what the British called them. They were called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. In effect, the acts placed the colony of Massachusetts under British Army rule. So, in other words, the British military invaded Massachusetts, okay, and they walked around. All officials received their direct appointments from London, and the citizens of Massachusetts no longer had much say in their affairs. The colonists could not hold a town meeting without first getting special permission to do so. Okay? And this doesn't say, but they closed Boston Harbor, which was very bad. Because they closed the harbor, the colonists were cut off from many of the supplies that they needed. All right? But instead of being intimidated, the other colonies rallied to the Patriot cause. They sent representatives to the city of Philadelphia, where on September 5th, 1774, a Continental Congress convened to formally protest the Intolerable Acts and to plan measures of collective resistance, including a framework of mutual assistance and response. So the colonists were like, this is unacceptable, and so we're going to protest. We're not doing it. At the same time that the Americans were meeting, Parliament was trying to decide exactly what it should do next. During one of its many debates, Colonel Isaac Barr of the British Army warned that if Parliament did not act wisely and justly, the colonies would soon have their date of independence and be totally free of English rule, whether England liked it or not. Okay? So, on April 19th, 1775, in the Massachusetts town of Lexington, Concord, his predictions came true. So, at this time, there was the first battle, which is the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But you guys are going to read about the battle before that. So, just so you know, the fighting of the American Revolution started way before the Declaration of Independence was passed. Okay? Because the Declaration of Independence was not passed until July 4th of 1776. So the fighting started in 1775. Okay? At Lexington, Concord. That was the first one. All right? And so that's the basic introduction of how the American Revolution began. So now I want you to make sure that you understand the causes of the American Revolution. So in the next video, I'm going to show you where to go to get to your resource.